The Vossari mother hit the fence at full speed, and the containment grid buckled inward with a sound like a ship hull tearing. Ren Castillo was already running before the alarm klaxon even cycled its first rotation. She had heard the distress bellow from Enclosure 9 through 3 walls of reinforced biocomposite and 2 sealed corridor hatches, and the sound had punched through her nervous system the way no alarm tone ever could. That was a mother defending cubs. Every year she had spent working predator enclosures on 6 different worlds had burned that frequency into her bones. The low, guttural vibration that meant something had crossed a line that no predator would allow crossed, and that whatever happened next would be fast and absolute, and very, very bloody. She came around the corner of the feeding prep bay and nearly collided with Tannic, the Vossari security supervisor, who was backing away from the viewing corridor with his shock lance drawn and his crest flat against his skull, the Vossari equivalent of full-body terror. "Castillo, do not go in there," he said. His translator rendered the words flat, but his voice was vibrating at the edges. "The female has gone hostile. We are sealing the block." "What triggered her?" "Maintenance drone. It entered the den zone during nursing. She destroyed it, and now she is." Another impact sound. The containment grid groaned. Somewhere inside Enclosure 9, something heavy hit a wall, and then there was a sound that Ren had heard only twice before in her career. The high, thin wail of predator cubs in terror. Not pain. Terror. The cubs were screaming because their mother was fighting something, and their world had suddenly become a place where the one thing that kept them alive might not win. Ren pushed past Tannic. He grabbed her arm. She looked at his hand on her sleeve and then looked at his face, and whatever he saw in her expression made him let go. "The grid is compromised," he called after her, "if she gets through." "She won't come through the grid," Ren said without turning around. "She'll go through the wall." She was right. By the time she reached the access corridor to Enclosure 9, the Vossari female, 300 kilograms of slate-gray fur and black-ridged bone plates, with jaws wide enough to close around a grown Vossari's torso, had abandoned the damaged containment fence entirely and turned her fury on the maintenance drone's wreckage. The drone was already in pieces, but the female was still tearing at the debris, shaking fragments of composite housing in her jaws and slamming them against the enclosure floor with enough force to crack the substrate. Her dorsal ridge was fully raised, a crest of interlocking bone plates that fanned out along her spine like a saw blade, each plate edged with keratin sharp enough to split hide. Her 6 eyes were locked open, the secondary pair on the sides of her skull tracking every shadow in the enclosure while the primary pair fixed on the wreckage. Behind her, pressed against the far wall of the den alcove, 4 cubs huddled in a pile. The smallest was no bigger than Ren's forearm, its fur still the mottled silver of a newborn. The largest was perhaps 2 months old, big enough to have opened its own secondary eyes, which were wide and wet, and tracking its mother's movements with the fixed intensity of a creature that had just learned the world could hurt. Ren stopped at the access hatch and watched. She did not open it. She did not speak. She stood very still and let the female register her presence through the transparent section of the corridor wall. The Vossari's head swung toward her, 6 eyes locked on. The bone crest rose higher. A sound came out of the female that Ren felt in her sternum, not a growl, not a roar, but a subsonic vibration that predator species across dozens of worlds used to communicate the same message. "I will kill anything that moves." Ren held still. She breathed. She kept her hands at her sides, palms open, fingers relaxed. She did not blink. 20 seconds passed. The vibration faded. The bone crest lowered by 2 centimeters. Not much, but enough. Ren reached up, very slowly, and pressed the intercom panel beside the access hatch. She kept her eyes on the female as she spoke. "Tannic, I need the corridor lights in this section dropped to 15%. And kill the klaxon." "Castillo." "Kill the klaxon, Tannic." The alarm cut off mid-cycle. The sudden silence was so complete that Wren could hear the cubs breathing fast, shallow, the rapid panting of small creatures whose hearts were beating too hard for their bodies. She could hear the females breathing too, slower, deeper, still vibrating at the edges, but the pitch was dropping. The corridor lights dimmed. The harsh white of the emergency floods faded to a soft amber that bled through the transparent wall section and pooled on the enclosure floor. Wren watched the female's bone crest settle another centimeter. The secondary eyes on the sides of her skull half closed, not relaxing, but shifting from combat scan to den guard mode. She was still between the wreckage and the cubs. She would stay there until either the threat was eliminated or she was dead. Wren understood that. She had spent 11 years understanding that. She had signed on to the Pelori Xenofauna Preservation Station at 29 because nobody else had applied. Because the job listing had described the facility as a containment and rehabilitation center for apex predator species confiscated from illegal trafficking operations across the Vossari administrative corridor. And most people who read those words thought of danger and discomfort, and the particular kind of loneliness that came from spending your days surrounded by creatures that could kill you. Wren had read those words and thought of the ranch. She had grown up on a deathworld cattle station in the Saro Basin, where the fences were not to keep livestock in, but to slow down the things that came down from the ridgeline at night. Her father had taught her to sit on the porch at dusk and listen to the ridge cats scream, not because he wanted her to be brave, but because he wanted her to understand the difference between a creature that was hunting and a creature that was afraid. A hunting predator was silent. A screaming predator was telling you where it was because it wanted you to leave. The dangerous ones, he had said, were the ones that stopped screaming. That lesson had carried her through 6 alien wildlife postings, through 3 containment breaches, through the time a Kellax bull had pinned her against a wall with its horn plate, and she had talked to it for 40 minutes in a steady, low voice, until it decided she was not worth the effort of killing and walked away. She opened the access hatch. Behind her in the corridor, she heard Tanik's sharp intake of breath. She heard the click of a shock lance being raised to firing position. She did not turn around. "Tanik," she said quietly, "put that down. I am covering you." You are threatening her cubs. She can see the lance through the wall. Put it down or leave the corridor. A pause, then the soft click of the lance being lowered. Wren did not wait for confirmation. She stepped through the hatch and into enclosure 9. The female's head snapped toward her. The bone crest went up. The subsonic vibration hit Wren's chest like a fist, and she felt her ribs hum with it. 6 eyes, each the size of a Vossari fist, locked onto her with the fixed predatory focus of a creature that was calculating exactly how many steps it would take to close the distance, and exactly how many bites it would take to end the threat. Wren stopped 3 meters inside the hatch. She lowered herself to the floor. Not slowly, slowly would look like stalking. She dropped straight down, folding her legs beneath her, and sat. Her hands went to her knees, palms up. "Hey," she said. Her voice was low, even the register she used for every apex predator she had ever worked with, the pitch that said, "I am not food, and I am not a threat, and I am not going anywhere. It's all right. The thing that scared your babies is broken. It's done. You got it." The female stared at her. The vibration continued for another 10 seconds, and then it faded to a low hum, and then it stopped. The bone crest held its position, raised, ready, but the secondary eyes half closed again. Wren sat, she breathed. She did not move her hands. From the den alcove behind the female, the smallest cub made a sound. Not the terror wail from before, something smaller, thinner, a questioning chirp that rose at the end like a sentence fragment. The cub was asking its mother if the world was safe again. The female's head turned toward the sound. When her primary eyes left Wren, Wren felt the release of attention like a physical weight lifting off her shoulders. The female made a sound back, a low, rolling chuff that Wren had catalogued in her observation logs as a contact call, the predator equivalent of "I'm here." The cub chirped again. Then it moved. It peeled away from the huddle of its siblings and took 3 wobbling steps toward its mother, its mottled silver fur standing on end, its tiny secondary eyes blinking open and closed with the erratic rhythm of an infant learning to use sensory organs it didn't fully understand yet. It reached its mother's flank and pressed its face into the thick fur below the bone ridge, and the female curved her neck around and ran her jaw along the cub's back, a grooming stroke, firm enough to flatten the standing fur, gentle enough that the cub's eyes closed, and it made a sound that was almost unmistakably a purr. Wren watched. Something in her chest shifted. She had seen predator mothers with cubs hundreds of times. She had never stopped feeling it, the particular quality of gentleness that came from a creature built entirely for violence, choosing, deliberately and with precision, to be soft. Then the cub turned its head toward Wren, its primary eyes still the cloudy blue-gray of infancy, not yet hardened into the amber of adulthood, fixed on her face. It stared at her for a long moment. Then it released its grip on its mother's flank and took a step toward Wren. The female's head snapped around. Every bone plate on her crest went up. The subsonic vibration started again, and Wren felt her lungs compress. "Easy," Wren said. "Easy, I'm right here. I'm not going to touch your baby." The cub took another step. Its legs were unsteady, the kind of wobble that meant it had been born within the last week. It was moving on instinct, not toward a threat, not away from safety, but toward something its infant nervous system had identified as interesting. Its nostrils were flaring, pulling in Wren's scent. It chirped again, the same questioning sound, and then it sat down between its mother and Wren, equidistant from both, and looked back and forth between them as if waiting for someone to explain what happened next. Wren did not move. The female stared at her cub, then at Wren, then at her cub again. The bone crest lowered not all the way, but to the halfway position that Wren's observation logs described as vigilant assessment. The vibration dropped to a background hum. The cub yawned. Its jaws opened wide enough to show the pink interior of its mouth and the tiny buds of teeth that would, in 6 months, be long enough to puncture hull plating. Its tongue curled. It made a small sound that was half yawn and half chirp, and then it lay down on the enclosure floor, tucked its nose under its forepaw, and closed its eyes. Between a 300-kilogram apex predator and a human woman sitting on the floor with her palms on her knees, a cub the size of a boot had decided the crisis was over, and it was time for a nap. Wren looked at the female looked at the sleeping cub, then the female looked at Wren. Something passed between them that Wren did not have a word for and did not try to name. It was not trust, not yet. It was something older and simpler. It was one mother recognizing that another creature understood what the cub's nap meant, that the nap was the most important thing in the room, that the sleeping cub was the reason the drone was in pieces, and the containment grid was buckled and the bone crest was raised, and that protecting the nap was the only thing that mattered. The female lowered her crest, all the way down, her secondary eyes closed. She turned away from Wren, walked to the den alcove, and lay down around her remaining 3 cubs. She curled her massive body into a C shape, her bone plates folding flat against her spine, and the cubs pressed into her belly and disappeared into gray fur. The smallest cub, still sleeping on the open floor between Wren and the den, did not stir. Wren sat with it for 20 minutes. She did not move. She did not speak. She sat and breathed and listened to the cub sleep and the female breathe and the station hum around them. Outside the enclosure, the station went about its business. She could hear the distant clatter of supply carts in the main corridor, the muffled chime of a shift change announcement 2 blocks away, the ever-present whir of atmospheric scrubbers laboring to keep the air inside the predator block at the particular oxygen-nitrogen balance that Vossari lungs required. None of it reached the cub. The sleeping creature's ears, broad, triangular, lined with the fine sensory hairs that would one day allow it to track prey through dense forest canopy by sound alone, were folded flat against its skull in the posture of absolute rest. Its breathing had slowed to a rhythm so deep that Wren could see its ribs expand and contract through the mottled silver fur, each breath moving its entire body in a gentle, rocking motion that reminded her, absurdly and precisely, of a boat on still water. Wren thought about her father's porch and the sound of ridge cats screaming on the far side of the fence, and the way he had said, "The ones you need to worry about are the ones that go quiet. The loud ones are just telling you they're scared." When the cub finally stirred, stretching its legs, yawning again, blinking its cloudy eyes, it looked at Wren, looked at its mother, and then got up and wobbled back to the den. The female's head rose as the cub approached. She opened the curve of her body, and the cub pushed into the warm space between her belly and her siblings, and the female closed around it and rested her jaw on the floor. Her primary eyes stayed on Wren, not with threat, not with warning, just watching. Wren stood up slowly. She backed toward the access hatch without turning around. She stepped through, sealed it behind her, and found Tannic standing in the corridor with 4 armed security officers and Dr. Sevra, the station's xenobiologist, who was holding a tablet in both hands and staring at Wren as though she had just walked out of a reactor core. "She let you sit with the cubs," Sevra said. The translator gave his voice an academic flatness, but his facial tendrils were rippling in the pattern that meant profound agitation. A Vossari alpha female in a defensive state, with nursing cubs, let a non-pack organism sit within striking distance of her youngest offspring. "She didn't let me do anything," Wren said. "She decided I wasn't a threat." That is, the literature on Vossari maternal behavior specifically states that no non-pack organism has ever. The literature was written by people who brought shock lances into the enclosure, Wren said. She walked past him toward the feeding prep bay. "Fix the containment grid and get rid of every maintenance drone with autonomous routing in the predator block. From now on, nothing enters an enclosure with cubs unless I clear it personally." She did not see Sevra's face. She did not need to. She heard him dictating notes into his tablet as she walked away, his voice tight with the particular frustration of a scientist whose data had just been invalidated by a woman who sat on the floor and said, "Hey." Over the next 6 weeks, Wren rebuilt the protocols for Enclosure 9 from the ground up. She removed the automated feeding system and replaced it with manual delivery herself, twice a day, entering the enclosure through the access hatch with a container of raw protein blocks prepared in the feeding bay. She brought the same container every time, placed it in the same spot, and retreated to the same distance. She wore the same coveralls. She used the same low voice. She made herself predictable, because predictability was the only currency a predator respected. The female watched her every time. During the first week, the bone crest stayed at half-mast whenever Wren entered, not threatening, not relaxed, but assessing. The cubs stayed in the den. The female positioned herself between Wren and the den alcove and did not move until Wren left. During the second week, the crest stayed down. The female still watched, but her secondary eyes were closed during feeding, which meant she was monitoring Wren with her primary pair only attention, not threat assessment. The cubs began to emerge from the den while Wren was present, tumbling over each other in the clumsy, anarchic sprawl of young predators, learning that their legs could do more than carry them from the den to their mother's belly and back. During the third week, the smallest cub, the one that had slept on the floor between Wren and the female on the first day, walked past its mother during a feeding run, crossed the enclosure floor in a determined wobble, and sat down next to Wren's knee. Wren did not move. She did not look at the cub. She looked at the female. The female's head was up. Her crest was flat. Her primary eyes were on the cub. She made no sound. The cub leaned against Wren's leg. Its fur was warm through the fabric of her coveralls. It weighed perhaps 4 kilograms, the weight of a large book, the weight of a sleeping cat. It pressed its face into the side of Ren's knee and made the chirping sound, and then it was quiet. Ren sat very still and felt the cub breathe against her leg and thought, "This is how it starts." By the 4th week, all 4 cubs were greeting her when she entered the enclosure. The 2 older ones would run to the food container and begin eating immediately, their table manners as poor as any predator juveniles, shouldering each other aside, growling over choice pieces, dragging protein blocks across the floor and leaving streaks of nutrient paste on the substrate. The 3rd cub, the shy one with a darker patch of fur over its left eye, would approach the container cautiously, take a block, and retreat to eat near the den. The smallest cub did not go to the food first. It came to Ren. It would sit next to her knee. Sometimes it would lean against her. Sometimes it would put its forepaws on her thigh and stretch upward, trying to reach her face with its nose. Its secondary eyes had fully opened by now, 4 amber points in its silver face, tracking Ren's every microexpression with the precision of a creature that was learning to read another species the way its mother read wind patterns and ground vibrations. Ren named it. She knew she should not have. Every xenofauna protocol she had ever read said the same thing. Do not name confiscated wildlife. Do not create personal attachment. Maintain professional distance for the safety of both handler and subject. She named it anyway. She called it Pip. The name came out of her mouth during the 5th week, when Pip had climbed into her lap for the first time, a slow, deliberate ascent, 1 paw at a time, pausing at each stage to check whether the human was going to do anything alarming, and settled against her stomach with a sigh that sounded like every tired child Ren had ever known. "Easy, Pip," she had said, adjusting her hands to make room without touching. "Easy now." The female had watched from 4 meters away. Her crest was flat. Her eyes were half closed. She had seen her cub climb into a non-pack organism's lap, and she had not moved, had not vibrated, had not raised a single bone plate. She had made a decision about Ren Castillo, and the decision was final. Severa documented everything. He set up observation feeds on 6 angles of enclosure 9 and recorded every interaction. He ran biometric scans on the female's stress markers and found that her cortisol analog levels dropped by 31% when Ren was in the enclosure. He measured the cub's growth rates and found they were tracking 14% above the median for captive Vossari, an unprecedented number that he attributed in his reports to reduced maternal stress associated with the presence of a consistent, non-threatening conspecific analog. "She doesn't think I'm a conspecific," Ren told him when he showed her the report. "She knows exactly what I am. She just decided it doesn't matter." "That is not consistent with the literature." "I know." The station commander, a Brevari career officer named Velen, was less interested in the science and more interested in the logistics. The Vossari female and her cubs were scheduled for transfer to the Brevari military's Predator Warfare Division, the same program that had requisitioned the Thornback specimens from the Verath Prime campaign. The cubs, once mature enough, would be separated from the mother and individually imprint-trained for combat deployment. The mother, if she cooperated with handlers, would be used for breeding stock. If she did not cooperate, she would be euthanized and her genetic material harvested. Ren had read the transfer orders. She had read them twice, sitting in the feeding prep bay after her evening round, with Pip's warmth still fading from her coveralls where the cub had pressed against her stomach. She had set the datapad down on the counter very carefully, the way you set down something that might detonate. Then she had walked to Commander Velen's office and told him the transfer would not happen. Velen was a Brevari bureaucrat with a polished carapace and the practiced patience of someone who managed a station full of dangerous animals and the equally dangerous humans who tended them. He had listened to Ren's argument with his crest at neutral. his secondary eyes tracking the data points she presented. The female's stress markers, the cub's growth rates, the documented behavioral evidence that the pack bond had expanded to include a human handler, a development with research implications that far outweighed the military's combat deployment schedule. "Handler Castillo," he said when she finished. "The military division has jurisdiction over confiscated predator assets. This station is a holding facility. We do not determine disposition. The female will kill anyone who tries to separate her cubs. That is why the military sends armored extraction teams. She will kill the armored extraction team, and then she will kill anyone else in the facility before they put her down. You've seen her tear through a containment grid. You think armor plating is going to stop 300 kilograms of Vossari in a maternal rage. Then we sedate. You sedate a nursing Vossari female, and the cubs will refuse to feed. They imprint on the mother's active scent during nursing. An unconscious mother produces a dormant scent profile. The cubs will interpret it as death and enter a starvation spiral. You will lose all 4 cubs within 72 hours. Velen's crest rippled, a wave of color running from the base of his skull to the tip, which Ren had learned to read as the breviary equivalent of a man, realizing that every option he thought he had was worse than the problem. You know a great deal about a species that has been in captivity for less than 4 standard months. I sit with her every day. That's more contact than every Vossari researcher in the breviary database combined. Your attachment to this animal is noted." Ren felt the words land. She felt the shape of what was coming, the professional concern, the recommendation for reassignment, the quiet removal of the inconvenient human who had gotten too close to her charges. She had seen it before. She had been the inconvenient human before. On Kelak's station, where she had argued against the culling of a breeding pair of ridge stalkers and been transferred to sanitation duty. On Varath 6, where she had reported a handling team for shock conditioning a juvenile and been told her contract would not be renewed. She had always been too close. That was the charge, too close to the animals, too invested, too human about it. She looked at Velen and said, "My attachment is the reason she hasn't killed anyone on the station." That stopped him. His crest went flat, the breviary processing posture, the equivalent of a long, careful silence. "Explain," he said. "She was trafficked from a wild pack on Vossari Prime. She was pregnant when they captured her. She gave birth in a holding crate during transit, a crate designed for cargo, not for a mother in labor. Her first experience of captivity was contractions in a metal box. Every handler she has encountered since has approached her with restraint protocols, shock lances, sedation rigs, dominance posturing. She killed 2 of them because they threatened her cubs. She destroyed a maintenance drone because it entered her den space during nursing. She is not aggressive. She is a mother in a cage surrounded by things that act like predators, and she is responding exactly the way 300 million years of evolution tell her to." "And you?" I sat on the floor and let her decide. Velen was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "The military extraction team arrives in 11 days. I know. I do not have authority to countermand the transfer order. I know that too. What are you asking me for, Handler Castillo?" Ren looked at him. 11 days, she said. "Don't send anyone into enclosure 9 except me. Keep the corridor clear. Keep the shock lances out of the predator block entirely. Give me 11 days. To do what? To prove that what I've built with her is worth more than what they'll destroy." Velen's crest held flat for another 10 seconds. Then it rose to neutral, the breviary equivalent of a man who had weighed the costs and decided he could live with the risk. 11 days, he said. "Do not make me regret this." Ren used every one of them. She spent the first 3 days documenting. She brought Sevra's observation feeds, the biometric data, the growth curves, the behavioral logs, everything the 6 cameras had captured over 6 weeks of daily contact. She compiled a report that ran to 47 pages and included holographic captures of every significant interaction: the first day, when the cub slept between her and the female; the 3rd week, when the cub sat by her knee; the 5th week, when Pip climbed into her lap and the female's crest stayed down. She sent copies to the Vossari Science Directorate, the Interspecies Wildlife Conservation Board, and the Galactic Xenofauna Research Consortium. She flagged every copy as urgent and appended a single-paragraph summary that said, in clinical language, what she believed in plain language: "This bond has never existed before, and if you break it, you will learn nothing, and the mother will die fighting, and the cubs will die after." She spent the next 4 days in the enclosure. Not just feeding runs, she stayed. She sat with the cubs for hours at a time, letting them explore her, letting them climb her, letting them fall asleep against her while the observation feeds recorded every moment. Pip was in her lap within minutes of every entry. The 2 older cubs had graduated from cautious approach to comfortable proximity. They would eat near her, shoulder to shoulder with each other, growling over protein blocks while leaning against her knees as though she were a piece of furniture that happened to be warm. The shy one with the dark eye patch would sit a meter away and watch her with all 6 eyes. And sometimes, when the enclosure was very quiet and the lights were low, it would creep forward and rest its chin on her boot. The female watched all of it. She had moved her resting position during the 2nd week of the bond, no longer between Wren and the den, but beside the den, at an angle that let her see Wren and the cubs simultaneously. She was not guarding against Wren anymore. She was watching her cubs choose, and she was allowing it. On the 7th day of Wren's 11, the female stood up during a feeding run, walked across the enclosure floor with the unhurried stride of a creature that has never needed to rush because nothing in its evolutionary history has ever been fast enough to catch it, and stopped 1 meter from Wren. Wren was sitting with Pip in her lap, and the 2 older cubs pressed against her sides. She looked up at 300 kilograms of bone-plated predator standing over her, and felt her heartbeat accelerate and her breathing stay even and her hands stay open and still. She had been in this position before, the moment when the predator closes the last distance and you find out what its decision is. Every other time in her career, the decision had been tolerance, coexistence, the animal accepting the human's presence without engaging. The female lowered her head. Her primary eyes were level with Wren's face. Her breath was warm and smelled of protein blocks, and something underneath that, a musk, dense and old, the scent of a species that had been apex predators for longer than most civilizations had existed. Her jaw was close enough that Wren could count the individual hairs on the sensory whiskers that lined her muzzle. She pressed her forehead against Wren's shoulder. The pressure was enormous, the weight of that skull, the density of bone behind the hide and the plate. Wren's shoulder compressed under it. She braced herself without thinking, one hand going to the floor behind her for stability, careful not to disturb Pip in her lap. The female held the position for 5 seconds, her eyes closed. The bone crest was so flat it was nearly invisible against her spine. The subsonic hum that always lived in her chest when another species was near had gone completely silent. Then she withdrew, turned and walked back to the den and lay down. Wren sat very still for a long time after that. Pip had not moved. The cub's breathing had not even changed rhythm during the contact, as though a 300-kilogram predator pressing its skull against their human was the most ordinary thing in the world. The cubs against her sides had not moved. The enclosure was quiet except for the soft sounds of predators breathing, and the distant hum of station systems that did not know or care that something unprecedented had just happened on their watch. Wren's shoulder ached where the female's skull had pressed. It was a good ache, the kind that came from bearing a weight willingly. She rolled it once, gently, and Pip stirred in her lap, repositioned, and settled again with a sigh. The 2 older cubs had fallen asleep against her knees, their jaws resting on each other's backs, their bone ridges interlocked in the juvenile version of the protective formation that adult Vossari used when sleeping in open terrain. Even asleep, even as cubs, the architecture of their bodies was designed for mutual defense. They were built to protect each other, and they had arranged themselves around her as though she were one of them. When she finally stood up and walked out, Sevra was waiting in the corridor. He had watched the entire thing on the observation feed. His facial tendrils were motionless, the Vossari expression that meant he had exhausted his capacity for surprise. "That was a pack bond gesture," he said. His voice had lost its academic flatness. It was quiet and careful, the voice of a man who understood he was speaking about something he had never expected to witness. She initiated a physical contact reserved for pack alpha acknowledgement. There is no documented instance of a Vossari performing that behavior with a non-Vossari organism in the entirety of the literature. "Not once." "I know," Ren said. "Handler Castillo, she has accepted you into her pack." "I know." "The military extraction team arrives in 4 days." Ren looked at him. Sevra's tendrils moved once, a small ripple that she had learned meant he was making a decision. Then he said, "I have sent my observational data to the Science Directorate. I have recommended that this pack unit be reclassified from military asset to protected research subject. I do not know if it will arrive in time, but I have exercised every expedite authority my position carries." "Thank you, Sevra." "Do not thank me. Thank the cub that fell asleep between you and an apex predator on the first day. It made the data compelling." The extraction team arrived on schedule. 4 armored Vossari soldiers in combat hardsuits, with a sedation rig, a cub separation cage built from reinforced containment mesh, and transfer orders signed by the Military Predator Warfare Division. They were professional. They were courteous. Their team leader, a staff sergeant named Korath, reviewed the facility layout with Commander Velen and asked for a full briefing on the Vossari female's behavioral profile. Velen directed him to Ren. Korath listened to her with the patient attention of a soldier who had done predator extractions before and understood that the handler always had opinions, and the opinions were always some version of "please don't." He nodded at the right moments. He asked competent questions about the enclosure layout, the female's reaction radius, the cub's mobility, the distance from the den to the access hatch. He was calm and professional, and he was going to take the cubs away from their mother and send them to a program that would train the softness out of them and replace it with triggers. "Handler Castillo," he said when she finished, "I appreciate the thoroughness of your assessment. We will proceed with the standard extraction protocol. Sedate the female, contain the cubs individually, and transport. If you sedate her, the cubs will die." He paused. "Our veterinary team has never worked with Vossari. Nobody has. I am the only person on this station or any station who has sustained daily physical contact with a Vossari pack unit for 6 weeks. If you sedate that female, her cubs will enter a starvation spiral within 12 hours and be dead within 72. You will deliver 4 dead cubs to your division. That is not an opinion. That is a documented biological certainty based on data your veterinary team does not have." Korath looked at her for a long moment. His eyes behind the hardsuit visor were the flat amber of a career soldier, and they held the particular kind of calculation that Ren had learned to read during her years of working with military personnel. The calculation of a man weighing the cost of listening against the cost of not listening, and factoring in the cost of explaining dead cubs to his commanding officer. "What do you propose?" he said. "Walk with me," Ren said, "into the enclosure, without the armor, without the sedation rig, without weapons. Walk in, sit down, and let her see you. Let her decide whether you are a threat to her cubs. If she decides you aren't, you can approach them. If she decides you are, you walk out and we discuss alternatives." You are asking me to enter an enclosure with an unsedated Vossari alpha female who has killed 2 handlers, without armor. I am asking you to enter her home without looking like the people who put her in a cage. Koreth's jaw tightened behind the visor. He looked at Velen. Velen's crest was at neutral. The commander was not going to help him and was not going to stop him. He looked back at Ren. And if she attacks? She won't. Not if you're with me. She has accepted me as pack. Anyone who enters that enclosure beside me, without weapons, without threat posture, is covered by that acceptance until they give her a reason to revoke it. You are staking my life on a predator's decision. Yes, Ren said. That's how it works. That's how it has always worked. Every bond between a predator and another species in the history of every world that has ever produced both starts with one organism deciding to trust the other's judgment. I am telling you that I trust hers. The question is whether you trust mine. Koreth did not enter the enclosure. He ordered his team to begin extraction protocols at dawn. Standard procedure. Armored approach with sedation, rig deployed through the feeding port. No handler consultation required. Ren went to the enclosure one last time that evening. She entered through the access hatch the way she always did, same coveralls, same container, same low voice. Pip was waiting for her. The cub had started anticipating her arrival times during the 4th week and would position itself halfway between the den and the hatch, sitting upright with its tail curled around its forepaws, its 6 eyes fixed on the door. When Ren opened it, Pip's entire body vibrated, not the subsonic threat vibration of its mother, but something lighter, faster, a frequency that Ren had never found in any behavioral database because no one had ever been close enough to a Vossari cub to feel it. It was excitement. It was joy. It was the full-body expression of a young predator that had learned to love something and did not have the evolutionary toolkit to hide it. She sat down and Pip climbed into her lap, and the other cubs came and the female watched from the den, and Ren sat there in the amber light and felt the weight of what might be the last evening like this settle into her bones. She did not cry. She had trained herself out of crying in enclosures years ago. Most predator species could smell the chemical shift in human tears, and the last thing you wanted was a 300-kilogram mother interpreting your distress as a threat signal. But she held Pip a little closer than usual, and the cub, as though it understood, pressed a little harder against her chest. "Whatever happens tomorrow," she said quietly, not to the cub, not to the female, not to anyone but the empty air of the enclosure and the hum of the station and the silence that held all of it, "you are not going to a weapons program. I will put my body between you and that door if I have to. I have done it before. That is the one thing I know how to do." The female's primary eyes were on her, steady, unblinking. Ren met them and held them and did not look away. Ren spent that night in the corridor, outside enclosure 9. She sat on the floor with her back against the wall and her legs stretched out and her eyes closed, and listened to the female breathing on the other side of the partition. The slow, deep rhythm of a predator at rest, the occasional shift of 300 kilograms of muscle and bone, the soft chirps of cubs dreaming. At 300 station time, she heard footsteps in the corridor. She opened her eyes. Sevra was standing over her with a datapad in his hands. His facial tendrils were moving in a rapid pattern she had never seen before, fast, erratic, completely unlike his usual academic composure. He held the datapad out to her without speaking. Ren took it. On the screen was a message from the Galactic Xenofauna Research Consortium, flagged Priority Override, transmitted to Commander Velen, Staff Sergeant Koreth, and the Brevari Military Predator Warfare Division simultaneously. The message was 3 paragraphs long. The first paragraph cited Sevra's observational data and Ren's behavioral reports, and described the documented pack bond between a Vossari alpha female and a human handler as an interspecies behavioral phenomenon without precedent in the consortium's 400-year research archive. The second paragraph reclassified the Vossari pack unit from military asset to protected research subject under Consortium Directive 719, which prohibited the separation of bonded predator family units during active study and superseded military disposition orders. The third paragraph designated Ren Castillo as the pack unit's primary bonded handler, with sole authority over access, interaction, and disposition decisions for the duration of the research classification. Ren read it twice. Then she looked up at Sevra. "You filed this as an emergency reclassification petition," she said. "That requires a sitting consortium member to sponsor it within 24 hours. "Yes." "Who sponsored it?" Sevra's tendrils went still. "I did," he said. "I have held a consortium research seat for 11 years. I have never exercised the emergency petition privilege. It is intended for situations of extraordinary scientific significance." He paused. A Vossari alpha female pressing her forehead against a human's shoulder in a pack bond acknowledgement is, by any defensible scientific standard, extraordinary. Ren looked at the datapad. Then she looked at the wall beside her, the wall of enclosure 9, and through it, not with her eyes but with the part of her that had spent 6 weeks sitting on a floor and breathing and waiting. She felt the female and the cubs and the small, warm weight of Pip against her memory. "Thank you," she said. "Go get some sleep, Handler Castillo. You have a pack to tend in the morning." At dawn, Korath read the consortium directive. His face behind the visor went through a progression that Ren recognized from every military officer she had ever watched receive orders they disagreed with: anger, frustration, the cold professional acceptance of a man whose chain of command had just been overridden by a civilian authority with bigger jurisdiction and sharper teeth. He withdrew his team without incident. He did not speak to Ren as he left. Tanik watched the extraction team's transport lift away from the station dock. His crest was at full height, not threat, not alarm, but the trembling vertical that his species used for moments of recognition. He turned to Ren, who was standing in the corridor with the feeding container in her hands, ready for the morning run. "You faced down a military extraction team," he said, "with paperwork." "With data," Ren said, "and a xenobiologist who decided the data mattered." Tanik's crest held its position. "I owe you an apology," he said, "for the shock lance. On the first day, I was going to fire on her through the wall if she moved toward you." "I know." "You knew." "I heard the lance charge." A Vossari can hear a charge cycle from 50 meters through hull plating. If you had fired, she would have registered it as a weapon discharge near her cubs. She would have come through the wall, not the grid, the wall, and she would have killed everyone in the corridor before anyone could cycle a second shot. Tanik's crest dropped. "You walked into the enclosure knowing I had a charged weapon aimed at her." "I walked into the enclosure knowing you would lower it, because I asked you to, and you did." Tanik was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "The Brevari have a word for what you did, Keth Sora. It means placing your body in the path between a threat and a charge. It is what a parent does for a child. What a pack leader does for its members." "I'm not her pack leader." "No," Tanik said. "You are something we do not have a word for. A creature from another world who sits on the floor of a predator's den and earns a bond that our entire species has never achieved with any apex predator in our history. Perhaps it is time we made a word for it." Ren looked at him. Then she turned and walked toward enclosure 9. She opened the access hatch and stepped inside. Pip crossed the enclosure floor at a run. The first time the cub had ever run, its legs finally strong enough, its coordination finally sure enough to carry it at speed, and hit Ren's shins with enough force to make her take a step back. She looked down and saw 4 amber eyes looking up at her with the fixed, unwavering intensity of a creature that had decided, weeks ago, that this human was the center of its world. "Easy now, Pip," she said. She crouched down. Pip pressed its face into her palm. Its fur was warm, its breath was warm. Its heartbeat, fast and steady and alive, pulsed against her skin. Behind Pip, the other 3 cubs were coming. The 2 older ones shouldered each other aside, racing for the food container. The shy one with the dark eye patch stopped 2 meters away, sat down and watched, but its tail, for the first time, was moving. A slow wag back and forth that Wren had never seen it do before. The shy one. The one that had kept its distance for weeks, that had watched from 2 meters away with all 6 eyes and never once closed the gap to touching distance. Its tail was wagging. Slow, tentative, uncertain, as though the muscles responsible for the motion had never been asked to perform it before and were not entirely sure they were doing it right. But wagging. The predator equivalent of a child who had been afraid of strangers finally deciding that this particular one, might be safe. Wren held out her hand, palm up, fingers relaxed. The same gesture she had used 1,000 times with 100 different species. The shy cub looked at her hand. It looked at its siblings. It looked at its mother. Then it stood up, walked the 2 meters it had maintained like a treaty border for 6 weeks, and pressed its nose into Wren's palm. Its nose was cold. Its whiskers were soft. The dark patch over its left eye made it look like it was winking. Wren curled her fingers very gently against the side of its muzzle, and the cub leaned into the pressure, and its tail wagged faster. And for the first time in 6 weeks it made the chirping sound, the questioning chirp that its smallest sibling had been making since day 1. It was asking if this was real. Behind all of them, the female rose from the den. She walked across the enclosure floor, unhurried, and stopped in the center of the space between the den and the human. But she did not position herself between Wren and the cubs. For the first time, she lay down behind them, facing the access hatch, facing the door. She was guarding the entrance. She was guarding Wren the same way she guarded the cubs, because Wren was pack. Sevra, watching from the observation feed in his research bay, wrote 3 words in his log. He would later expand them into a 40-page paper that would be cited in xenofauna behavioral studies for decades, and would fundamentally alter the consortium's guidelines on interspecies predator management. But the first notation, the raw field note scrawled at 6:14 station time on a morning when the extraction team's transport was still visible as a diminishing point of light through the station's viewport, was 3 words. Pack bond confirmed. What the feeds could not capture, what no camera angle or biometric scan or stress marker analysis could render into data, was what happened after the lights dimmed to evening cycle, and the station settled into the quiet hum that came when the day's crises had been weathered, and the corridors emptied, and the only sounds were the environmental systems doing their slow, patient work of keeping everything alive. Wren sat in the enclosure with 4 cubs sprawled across her legs and the female lying 3 meters away, and the female made a sound that Wren had never heard before. Not the contact chuff, not the subsonic warning, not the grooming purr she used with the cubs. Something entirely new, a low, continuous tone that rose and fell in a slow wave, like breathing, like tides, like something very old remembering something from before cages and transit crates and shock lances. Something from when her species had roamed the dense forests of Vossari Prime, and the only sounds at night were the wind in the canopy, and the mothers singing their cubs to sleep. The cubs went still against Wren's legs, their eyes closed. They pressed closer to her warmth and each other's warmth, and they slept. Wren listened to the female sing. She thought about her father's porch and the ridge cats on the far side of the fence, and the lesson he had given her that had carried her through everything. The loud ones are just telling you they're scared. The quiet ones are the ones to watch. And the ones that sing, he had paused then, looking out at the dark ridgeline where the biggest, oldest ridge cat, the one the ranchers called Old Roan, sometimes sat in the last light and made a sound that was not a scream and not a growl, but something that made the hair on the back of your neck stand up and your chest fill with something you could not name. The ones that sing are telling you you're safe. The female sang. The cubs slept. Wren sat in the middle of an alien predator's den, on a station that had tried to separate a mother from her children, surrounded by 4 small bodies that trusted her enough to sleep in her lap, and she felt the song move through her bones and into the quiet place behind her ribs where she kept the things that mattered most: the porch, the ridge cats, her father's voice, the weight of a sleeping cub, the press of a predator's forehead against her shoulder. She stayed until the song ended. Then she pulled her coverall collar up against the chill of the station's recycled air, and she closed her eyes and she slept. In the morning, Pip was on her chest. Its forepaws were tucked under its chin. Its eyes were closed. Its tiny bone ridge, still flat and soft and weeks away from hardening into the armor that would one day make it one of the most formidable predators in the known galaxy, was pressed against Wren's collarbone like a child's head resting against its mother. The female was awake, lying in the same guardian position, her jaw on her forepaws, her primary eyes open and watching Wren and Pip and the 3 other cubs who had migrated during the night from Wren's legs to the warm space between the human and the mother, forming a bridge of sleeping bodies between 2 creatures who should never have understood each other, and understood each other completely. When Wren opened her eyes, the female blinked, slowly, once. Wren blinked back. Then Pip yawned and stretched, and dug its tiny claws into Wren's coveralls hard enough to leave 4 puncture marks in the fabric, and Wren laughed, the first sound she had made in the enclosure that was louder than a whisper, and the female's bone crest twitched once, a micro-movement that might have been surprise or might have been amusement, and the cubs stirred, and the day began the way it would begin every day after that, with a human woman sitting on the floor of a predator's den, holding a cub that could one day crush starship plating in its jaws, whispering, "Easy now, Pip, easy," while the most dangerous creature on the station lay 3 meters away and watched with the quiet, absolute certainty of something that had decided, not been forced, not been trained, not been broken, not been shocked into compliance, that this human belonged to them. The station logs would later record the methodology that emerged from Enclosure 9 as Protocol Gentle Hold. Severa had asked Wren what she called her approach, and Wren had said she did not call it anything, and Severa had asked what she said to the cubs when they were frightened, and Wren had said, "I tell them easy now, and I hold still, and I let them come to me." Gentle hold, that was what he wrote down. Close enough, he said. But Wren did not think of it as a protocol. She did not think of it as a methodology or a breakthrough or a legacy. She thought of it as what happened when you sat on the floor and let a predator decide, and the predator decided you were safe, and its cubs decided you were warm, and a mother who had given birth in a cage and killed to protect her children in a cage looked at you across the den floor with 6 amber eyes and sang you the song she sang her cubs. It was not a protocol. It was the sound a 300-kilogram apex predator made when she trusted you with everything she had. And Wren Castillo, handler's daughter from a deathworld ranch in the Saro Basin, sat in the den every evening and listened, and held still, and let the song fill the quiet place behind her ribs. And when the cubs slept and the station was dark and the only sound was the ancient, rolling voice of a mother who had decided that the universe contained at least one creature worth singing to, Wren whispered into the warm fur of the cub on her chest the only words that had ever mattered. "Easy now, gentle hold, I'm here." That was the whole trick. That was all of it.